I was never a man of great ambitions, not in the way people talk about legacy and dynasties, but I always believed that what little I built with my own two hands would hold some meaning, at least for my family, at least for my daughter. My name is Howard Meredith. I am 79 years old, and for the better part of 4 decades I ran a small restaurant on the corner of Jefferson and Elm, a brick building with green shutters and an old neon sign that buzzed in the winter when the snow gathered on the wires. To most people who passed by, it was just another family place where the portions were generous and the coffee strong, but to me it was a second home, a sanctuary, and in many ways the thread that kept my wife, Eleanor, and me bound to the community. We cherished. After her passing 7 years ago, the restaurant became something more. It became a kind of shrine to her memory. Every table polished the way she liked it, every recipe carrying her touch, even the framed photographs on the wall still showing her bright smile, as if she had only stepped into the kitchen and would return at any moment. I lived above the restaurant in a modest apartment, and every morning I would walk downstairs, open the blinds, switch on the lights, and take in the smell of coffee grounds and yesterday's bread as though they were companions greeting me. My life followed a quiet rhythm. I rose early, around 5, made myself oatmeal or sometimes just toast, and then checked the books from the day before. Business was not as booming as it had been in the 70s and 80s, when factory workers came after their shifts and young couples gathered for pie late at night. But we managed to keep the doors open, largely because the property had been paid off long ago, and because a handful of loyal customers still treated the place like their own living room. Retirees lingered over the newspaper, mothers with toddlers ordered pancakes, and a few regulars who had known me since my hair was black instead of grey came to talk baseball or politics. To them, I was still Mr. Meredith, the man who could carve a turkey faster than anyone in town and who poured coffee without looking at the cup. To myself, I was just an old widower who tried to keep going, who tried not to let grief swallow him whole. But if the restaurant was a solace, my personal life was a hollow chamber. My daughter Margaret, my only child, lived in the same city, but in another world entirely. She was ambitious, sharp, determined to prove that she was not defined by her parents' modest beginnings. From a young age she had looked at the restaurant, not with affection, but with a kind of irritation, as though the clinking of dishes and smell of frying onions were beneath her. Eleanor used to say she was simply practical, that Margaret wanted more from life, and perhaps she was right, but I often felt that my daughter was embarrassed by the very foundation that had put her through private school, college, and law school. While her friends came from families that owned firms and travelled to Europe in the summer, Margaret's father wore an apron and scrubbed griddles, and although I never complained or apologized for it, I saw in her eyes the quiet shame. When Eleanor died, I expected Margaret would step closer, not to the restaurant, but at least to me. I thought grief might bridge the distance, might remind her that family is not about appearances or status, but about presence, about holding one another in the unbearable nights when the house is too quiet. Instead, she seemed to drift further away, caught up in her career, her social circle, her husband who spoke more about investments and networking than about kindness or memory. They visited me occasionally, birthdays mostly, sitting stiffly at one of the corner tables, ordering meals as though they were customers rather than family. They would ask polite questions about my health, comment on how the neighborhood was changing, and then glance at their phones until it was time to leave. I told myself not to mind, that at least they came, but when the door closed behind them and I returned to the kitchen alone, I felt as though I had been a prop in a play staged for appearances. The restaurant, however, remained loyal, even if the world changed around it. The staff were young, students mostly, who rotated in and out, but a few stayed long enough to become almost like kin. Josephine, the cook, a woman in her 50s with a sharp tongue and a soft heart, had been with me for more than 20 years. She remembered Eleanor and spoke of her with reverence, sometimes correcting me when I forgot how much paprika went into the chicken soup, reminding me that, "This is Eleanor's recipe, Howard. Don't you dare change it." Customers often addressed me as Mr. Owner, a phrase that carried more dignity than I ever asked for, but one that made me straighten my back a little. Not out of pride for myself, but because I felt I was carrying Eleanor's spirit each time I unlocked the door. Still, as the years piled on, I began to sense a quiet anxiety growing inside me. My knees hurt when I climbed the stairs to the apartment. My hands shook slightly when I tried to sign receipts, and sometimes I forgot small details, whether I had locked the back door, whether I had added sugar to a batch of muffins. Nothing serious, nothing that would suggest I was incapable, but enough to remind me that time was not infinite. I often wondered what would happen to the restaurant when I could no longer manage it. Part of me hoped Margaret would see beyond her disdain and recognize its value, not just as a business but as a vessel of memory, a place where her mother's laughter still echoed. I dreamed that one day she might bring her own children here and tell them, "This is where your grandmother spent her life. This is where your grandfather worked every day," and that the restaurant would become a bridge between generations rather than a relic. Yet whenever I tried to broach the subject with her, Margaret dismissed me. "Dad, nobody eats in diners anymore. It's all about trendy spots, fusion cuisine, not meatloaf and mashed potatoes." Or she would wave her manicured hand and say, "You can't cling to the past forever. You should think about retirement, maybe sell the place before it becomes worthless." Her words cut me more deeply than she ever realized, because to her it was only business. But to me it was blood and memory and sweat. I never answered harshly. I only said that the restaurant was not just a building, it was the story of our family. She rolled her eyes at that, the way children do when they think their parents are being sentimental or foolish. So I kept quiet, and I kept working. My days were simple, almost ritualistic. In the afternoons, when the rush slowed, I would sit at the booth near the window with a cup of coffee, watching people pass by, sometimes recognizing faces from decades ago. A man who used to deliver newspapers now with grey hair of his own. A woman who once waitressed here, now pushing a stroller with her granddaughter. I found comfort in those cycles, in the way life turned even if mine felt stalled. In the evenings, after closing, I would walk upstairs, heat a can of soup, and watch the news until my eyes grew heavy. The apartment walls were filled with Eleanor's photographs, our wedding picture, Margaret's high school graduation, a family trip to Yellowstone where we all wore matching hats. I often stood in front of those frames longer than necessary, whispering apologies to Eleanor for not keeping our daughter closer, for not knowing how to bridge the gap that had widened year after year. If I am honest, by the time my 70s arrived, I had resigned myself to a quiet decline. I did not expect reconciliation, nor did I expect betrayal. I thought perhaps Margaret would one day soften, or that I would simply pass away in my sleep, leaving the restaurant as it was, like a time capsule. But life has a way of twisting when you least expect it. The moment that shifted everything seemed trivial at first. An ordinary dinner with my daughter, a waiter addressing me with a title that had always been mine, a small spark of pride that I dared to feel. I could not know then that it would become the crack in the facade, the beginning of a humiliation that would unravel what little bond remained between father and daughter. Looking back now, from the solitude of my apartment where silence is both a comfort and a curse, I see that the signs had been there all along, in her dismissive glances, in her clipped answers, in her refusal to call me father outside the boundaries of blood. But at the time, I still carried hope like an old man carries a photograph in his wallet, creased and fading yet impossible to throw away. It was early spring when Margaret called me and suggested we have dinner together at the restaurant. Not just the two of us, but with her husband and some of their acquaintances. People she described vaguely as colleagues and potential partners, without going into detail. I was surprised by the invitation because for years our meetings had been rare, often squeezed into a quick lunch where she seemed distracted or a rushed phone call that ended with the phrase, "I'll call you later, Dad," which never truly materialized. Her sudden enthusiasm felt unusual, and although a cautious part of me wondered what her motives were, another part of me, the part that still longed for recognition and connection, leapt at the chance. I polished the dining room that morning with unusual care, adjusted the blinds so the fading light would fall softly across the tables, and asked Josephine to prepare some of our more traditional dishes because I wanted Margaret's friends to experience the place as Eleanor and I had imagined it, not as some outdated diner, but as a warm and genuine corner of life where food and memory were inseparable. When they arrived, I felt a mixture of pride and nervousness. Margaret swept in first, elegant in a tailored jacket, her hair styled with precision, her expression carrying the kind of brisk determination that made her seem older than her years. Behind her came her husband, Everett, who gave me a curt nod and immediately checked his phone, as though to signal that he was far too important to linger in greetings. Their companions followed, a group of 4 men and 2 women dressed in expensive clothes, the kind of people who, I knew instinctively, would never step into my restaurant on their own unless invited by someone like Margaret. They looked around with polite curiosity, eyes moving from the framed photographs on the wall to the old jukebox in the corner, and although they smiled, I could sense their condescension, the way one looks at a relic from another time. I greeted them warmly, shaking hands, offering drinks, trying to ignore the stiffness in Margaret's posture. I wanted to believe that she had chosen this place because she remembered it as home, because she wanted to show her friends where she came from, but the evening unfolded differently. We sat at the largest booth, the one near the window where Eleanor and I used to sit after closing, and the conversation immediately veered toward business jargon, investment opportunities, development projects, none of which I understood or cared, for I listened politely, interjecting when asked, though it was clear I was not expected to contribute. The food arrived, plates of roast chicken, mashed potatoes, fresh rolls, and though our guests complimented the flavors, their eyes often drifted toward Margaret, waiting for her to steer the conversation. Then it happened. So small yet so devastating that even now I can recall the tone of her voice with a sharpness that pierces me. One of the waiters, a young man named Danny, who had only been with us for a few months but had quickly grown fond of the place, approached with the dessert tray and, trying to be respectful, asked with a smile, "What would you like us to bring for, Mr. Owner tonight?" It was nothing unusual. Most of the staff called me that, partly out of habit, partly out of affection. I nodded at him, ready to answer, when Margaret's voice cut through the air like glass. She leaned forward, her smile frozen, but her eyes hard, and said, "Don't call him that. And please don't call him my father either, not here, not in public." For a moment the table fell silent. Danny froze, his face flushing with embarrassment, murmured an apology, and retreated towards the kitchen. The others shifted uncomfortably, pretending to study their menus or sip their drinks, but the damage had already been done. I sat there, stunned, trying to process the words that had come so effortlessly from her mouth. Don't call him my father. Not in public. The weight of those syllables pressed down on me with a force I had not felt in years. I looked at Margaret, hoping to see some sign that she had misspoken, that she had been joking in poor taste, but her expression was composed, almost clinical, as though she had simply corrected a mistake. I wanted to ask her why, wanted to demand an explanation, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I forced myself to remain seated, to smile faintly as though nothing had happened, though inside I felt a deep humiliation blooming, spreading through me like a stain. For the remainder of the meal, I hardly spoke, listening as Margaret presented herself as the true force behind the restaurant, describing to her friends how she had helped modernize the business, how she was guiding her father in making decisions, how the place had been in the family for years, but was now evolving into something more sophisticated. Each phrase chipped away at me, because they were not just distortions of the truth, but erasures of my life's work. At one point, one of her colleagues asked politely, "So, Mr. Meredith, you must be proud of what your daughter is accomplishing here." And before I could answer, Margaret interjected, "Yes, he's happy to let me handle everything now. He prefers to stay in the background." She said it with a smile, and the group nodded approvingly, as if I were an elderly figurehead content to fade quietly. My hands trembled under the table, not from age but from anger and sorrow, yet I remained silent, because I knew that any protest would only deepen my humiliation. I felt invisible at my own table, in my own restaurant, and the echo of her earlier words, "Don't call him my father," reverberated in my chest until it was almost unbearable. After dinner, as the guests left, Margaret kissed me on the cheek in a perfunctory way, whispered, "Thank you for hosting us, Dad," in a tone so low no one else could hear, and walked out with her husband, her heels clicking against the floor. The waiter Danny approached me later, stammering apologies, saying he hadn't meant to cause trouble, and I told him it was not his fault, though I could see the pity in his eyes. That pity cut deeper than Margaret's coldness, because it meant that others had witnessed my degradation, that my dignity had been stripped not in private, but under the gaze of strangers and staff alike. That night I could not sleep. I sat in my apartment upstairs, staring at the ceiling, replaying her words over and over. For years I had accepted her distance, her indifference, even her disdain, telling myself that children grow apart, that she was busy, that her world was different from mine. But this was not indifference. This was rejection. She had not only dismissed me as her father, but had done so in a public space, in the very place that represented everything I had built for her and for Eleanor. I asked myself what I had done to deserve such treatment. Had I embarrassed her by owning a small restaurant? Had I failed to give her the kind of glamorous life she envied in others? Or was it simply that she no longer wished to be connected to me at all? The walls of the apartment felt suffocating, filled with photographs that suddenly seemed like relics of a life that had vanished. Eleanor's smile no longer comforted me. It haunted me, as though she were asking why our daughter had turned so cold. I thought of the years I had worked double shifts to pay for Margaret's education, the nights Eleanor and I had gone without, so that she could have ballet lessons, new books, trips with her classmates. I thought of the countless times I had told her I was proud of her, only to be met with silence. And now, after all of that, I was not even permitted the dignity of being acknowledged as her father in front of others. That was the catalyst, the moment when something broke inside me. Until then, I had endured neglect and silence, but I had clung to the hope that, beneath it all, Margaret still regarded me as her father, still carried some measure of respect, still saw me as the man who had raised her. That night, hope died. What remained was a raw, aching awareness that I was no longer family in her eyes, but an inconvenience, an obstacle, perhaps even an embarrassment. The realization was bitter, and though I tried to push it aside, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. In the days following that dinner, I tried to persuade myself that perhaps Margaret had spoken out of nervousness or had been carried away by the desire to impress her colleagues, that her words had not been meant to wound me so personally. I told myself that she was under pressure, that she was building her reputation in circles where appearances mattered more than truth, and that in such environments people sometimes say things they do not truly mean. But each time I replayed her voice in my memory, sharp and decisive, forbidding the waiter to call me her father, I could not shake the sense that it had been no slip of the tongue, but a deliberate choice, a calculated attempt to erase me from her narrative. That awareness sank into me like a stone, and though I tried to continue my daily routines, opening the restaurant, greeting the few loyal customers, checking the receipts, I felt as though a crack had opened beneath me, one that would not stop. Widening. Soon, small humiliations began to accumulate, each one reinforcing the message that my place in Margaret's life had been downgraded to something less than paternal, something closer to a nuisance. She began stopping by the restaurant more frequently, but not to see me. Rather, she came with Everett or with new acquaintances, speaking loudly about her plans for modernization, gesturing around the dining room as though she were the visionary, and I a relic still tolerated out of habit. When customers greeted me warmly, calling me Mr. Meredith or simply Howard, she would smile stiffly and redirect the conversation, saying, "Yes, he's still around, but we're working on updating things, bringing the business into the 21st century." There was no malice in her tone, but there was something even worse: dismissal, the casual erasure of my contribution, as though I were a stubborn shadow that lingered too long on the wall. One afternoon I overheard her speaking with a group of young investors she had brought into the restaurant. I had stepped into the hallway by the restrooms, carrying a box of supplies, when her voice carried through the half-open door. "Of course my father helped build this place years ago, but you know how it is. He's not really involved anymore. He doesn't understand how business works today. We've practically taken over the operations, Everett and I, and we're just waiting for the right time to rebrand." The investors laughed politely, murmuring about potential profits, while I stood frozen, my hands gripping the cardboard box so tightly that the edges cut into my palms. I could not bring myself to step into the room and contradict her, because to do so would have been to acknowledge that she had reduced me to a figurehead in the eyes of strangers. Instead, I turned quietly and carried the box back into the kitchen, where Josephine noticed my pale expression and asked what was wrong. I only shook my head, unable to form words. Not long after, the humiliations grew more direct. At a family gathering, if one could even call it that, since it consisted of Margaret, Everett, and a few of their friends, I was introduced not as her father, but as a partner in the restaurant. The phrase stunned me, not only because it stripped me of the dignity of fatherhood, but because it was a distortion of reality. I was not her partner. I was the founder, the man who had spent years turning raw ingredients into meals, who had scraped grease from pans at midnight, who had stood behind the counter when storms knocked out the lights, and we served customers by candlelight. Yet in her voice, I was reduced to a financial appendage, someone who had invested in her enterprise. I smiled mechanically, shook hands with the strangers, and swallowed my anger because I knew that showing it would only confirm the narrative she was building, that of a cranky old man out of touch with the modern world. The worst came when she began to interfere in the operations themselves. Without consulting me, she hired a graphic designer to propose new menus, sleek documents with minimalist fonts, and photographs of food that bore little resemblance to what we actually served. She presented them to me as though they were a gift, spreading the glossy pages across a booth and saying, "This is how people expect restaurants to look now, Dad. We need to get rid of these outdated laminated menus. They make the place look cheap." I reminded her gently that customers came here precisely because it was not polished, because it felt authentic. But she rolled her eyes and said, "Authentic is just another word for old-fashioned. If you want this place to survive, you need to let me handle it." Even Josephine, usually a woman of resilience, grew uneasy. She pulled me aside one evening after Margaret had left and said quietly, "She talks about this place like you're already gone." Howard, I don't like it. She doesn't see what this means to you, or to Eleanor's memory. I nodded, grateful for her loyalty, but powerless to change what was unfolding. For the first time, I began to dread Margaret's visits, not because I disliked her presence, but because I could no longer bear the way she diminished me in front of others, each time shaving away another piece of my identity until I hardly recognized myself. One evening, after closing, I found myself lingering in the darkened dining room, staring at the row of tables and the reflection of the neon sign flickering in the window. I thought of Eleanor, of the nights we had counted quarters to make payroll, of the afternoons she had baked pies while humming old songs, of the way she had once told me, "This place will be our gift to Margaret, so she knows where she comes from." The thought pierced me with such sorrow that I had to sit down, burying my face in my hands. Our gift had become an embarrassment, a burden that Margaret seemed determined to reshape into something unrecognizable, and in doing so, she had stripped me not only of my role as owner, but of my role as father. The first escalation was not a single dramatic event, but a series of small, cutting moments, each one harder to endure than the last. It was the way she corrected people when they addressed me with respect, the way she told stories that painted me as forgetful or incapable, the way she spoke of the restaurant as though it had only come alive when she arrived to manage it. Each slight might have been forgivable on its own, but together they formed a pattern, a deliberate rewriting of history in which I was a background character. I felt trapped in a performance where the script had been rewritten without my consent, where my role had been reduced to that of a silent extra. And yet, despite the growing weight of humiliation, a part of me still clung to the hope that things might change. I told myself that perhaps she was simply trying to prove herself, that once she felt secure in her accomplishments, she would allow me to step back into my rightful place, that she would one day introduce me proudly as her father rather than as an obstacle to be managed. But late at night, when the silence of the apartment pressed heavily against my chest, I felt the creeping certainty that this was only the beginning, that the distance between us would soon widen into something irreversible. The turning point came quietly, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the slow unveiling of a truth I had not wanted to consider. A truth that forced me to see my daughter not as the child I once carried on my shoulders, but as a calculating adult whose ambitions no longer had room for sentiment. It happened one afternoon when I stopped by the office above the restaurant where the papers and records were kept, a room Eleanor and I had always treated as the heart of the business, the place where we stored not just invoices and receipts, but letters from customers, photographs from community events, little mementos of a life built through service. I had not spent much time there in recent months, partly because my eyesight made reading difficult, and partly because I trusted that the routine of the restaurant was steady. But on that day, I wanted to retrieve an old photograph of Eleanor for the anniversary of her passing, something to place on the counter where the customers might remember her, too. When I opened the drawer of the desk, expecting to find the folder of photographs, I discovered instead a stack of legal documents, neatly arranged and bearing Margaret's handwriting on yellow sticky notes. At first I thought they were routine contracts for supplies or insurance, but as I leafed through them, my heart began to pound. They were transfer agreements, documents outlining the restructuring of ownership of the restaurant, with Margaret and Everett listed as the primary stakeholders and my name relegated to a diminished role, more symbolic than practical. There were signatures, my own included, on some of the pages, signatures I recognized as mine, but could not remember placing on those specific documents. I felt my breath catch as I realized what had happened. In the months when Margaret had encouraged me to sign routine paperwork, assuring me it was nothing but technical updates for tax purposes, she had been orchestrating a quiet takeover, slowly, transferring authority into her own hands while leaving me with little more than a ceremonial title. I sat at the desk for a long time, staring at the papers, my pulse loud in my ears. The betrayal was not merely legal. It was personal, a deliberate effort to reduce me to an afterthought in the very creation I had poured my life into. I tried to rationalize it at first, telling myself that perhaps she believed she was protecting me, that she thought I no longer had the strength to handle the complexities of ownership, but the cold precision of her notes and the way my role had been described in the documents, inactive partner, retained for heritage value, made it clear that sentiment had little to do with it. She had not wanted to shield me. She had wanted to erase me while still presenting the illusion of continuity. That evening, when Margaret visited the restaurant, I could hardly look at her. She swept in with her usual confidence, speaking of plans to introduce online ordering and weekend brunches, ideas that sounded more like a marketing pitch than a conversation with family. I tried to listen, but all I could see was the word inactive stamped across my identity, a word that suggested I was no longer a man of agency, but a relic to be displayed for effect. At one point, she turned to me and said with that rehearsed brightness in her voice, "Don't worry, Dad. We'll take care of everything. You don't need to trouble yourself with these details anymore. You've earned the right to relax." The words, meant to sound generous, struck me instead as the final nail in a coffin she had been building quietly for years. Later that night, unable to sleep, I went back to the office and read through every page of those documents. I realized then that Margaret and Everett had not only taken practical control of the restaurant, but had also made arrangements that would make it difficult for me to reverse anything without entering a legal battle. They had anticipated resistance, had built clauses that required majority signatures, and in every scenario I was outnumbered. It was not simply neglect anymore. It was strategy, an effort to sideline me until the day came when I would no longer be necessary, even as decoration. The shock of that discovery was not only in the realization of betrayal, but in the recognition of how blind I had been. I thought of Eleanor, of how she had often warned me not to indulge Margaret's ambition too freely, of how she had once whispered late at night, "She loves you, Howard, but she sees the world in terms of advantage, not loyalty. Be careful." I had dismissed those warnings, blinded by the love a father carries for his only child, unwilling to believe that she would ever see me as anything but her protector. Now I saw with cruel clarity that Eleanor had been right. In the days that followed, a new fear began to take root in me, one darker than humiliation. Margaret had begun to speak of my health with a tone that felt rehearsed, mentioning casually in front of others that I sometimes forgot things, that I often misplaced my keys, that perhaps I was showing the early signs of age-related decline. I had dismissed these remarks as careless exaggerations, but after discovering the documents I began to see them differently. They were not slips. They were narratives being crafted, stories designed to paint me as a man sliding into incompetence. If she could convince others of that, customers, staff, lawyers, then perhaps she could push me entirely out of the picture under the guise of protecting me. One afternoon, while I was in the dining room, I overheard her telling a customer, "You know, my father still insists on coming down here, but we have to watch over him. He forgets things sometimes. Just last week he almost locked himself out of the apartment." The customer gave her a sympathetic smile, the kind one reserves for families dealing with aging parents, and I felt my face burn with shame. I had not locked myself out. I had left the keys on the counter for a moment while unloading groceries, but the story once told carried more weight than truth, and I realized with a cold jolt that Margaret was preparing the ground, laying out evidence to prove that I was no longer fit to handle my affairs. This was the midpoint, the moment when my humiliation transformed into dread. No longer was it about embarrassment at dinner or erasure in conversation. Now it was about survival, about holding on to my very identity against a daughter who seemed willing, to declare me unfit in order to claim what she wanted. I sat alone in the apartment that night, staring at Eleanor's photograph, whispering into the stillness. What happened to her, Ellie? What happened to the little girl who used to draw pictures of us in crayon, who called me Daddy with pride? The silence gave me no answers, only the certainty that I was standing at the edge of a precipice, that what came next would either destroy me completely or force me to fight in a way I had never imagined I would have to fight against my own flesh and blood. What followed after that midpoint was not merely the erosion of dignity, but the exposure of intent. And if I had once clung to the fantasy that Margaret's coldness was born of misunderstanding or misguided ambition, the veil now lifted, revealing something far harsher, something that struck at the very core of my life. It began with small but unmistakable signs, the kind that gnaw at you because you sense a pattern forming long before you can articulate it. Margaret started arriving at the restaurant, not as a visitor, but as though she were the rightful owner, giving instructions to staff without consulting me, correcting recipes that had remained unchanged for 40 years, telling Josephine that customers wanted lighter, trendier options rather than the hearty meals that had kept our regulars loyal. At first, I bit my tongue, but when I asked her to at least speak to me before making changes, she looked at me with that peculiar mixture of pity and annoyance and said, "Dad, you don't understand how competitive the market is now. People expect different things. If you can't adapt, then let us handle it." It was not only in the restaurant that the shift grew more apparent. I noticed she began to visit my apartment more often under the pretense of checking on me, though her questions were not about my well-being but about where I kept certain documents, whether I had updated my insurance policies, whether I had considered drafting a medical directive. Once, she opened my kitchen drawers without asking, remarking that my medication bottles were too disorganized and suggested she should take charge of keeping track of my prescriptions. I bristled, telling her I was perfectly capable, but she sighed, smiled that rehearsed smile, and said, "It's just for your safety, Dad. You forget things sometimes, and I don't want you to make a mistake." It was not concern I heard in her voice. It was preparation, the steady gathering of evidence to support a case I had not yet fully imagined, but could already sense looming. A case that I was incompetent, that I needed a guardian, that I was no longer in control of my own life. One evening, Josephine came upstairs after closing, her face troubled. She had overheard Margaret and Everett in the dining room talking with a lawyer, discussing the possibility of having me declared mentally unfit to manage financial matters. Josephine told me she had stepped into the kitchen quietly and heard Everett say, "If we can establish a record of confusion, it won't be hard. Judges see this all the time." Margaret had replied, "He already shows the signs. He misplaces things constantly. If we present it properly, we can argue he needs protection, and then everything will be under our control." I felt the blood drain from my face as Josephine recounted this, because it confirmed the very dread I had been circling in my mind. They were not simply diminishing me socially. They were plotting to strip me legally, to take away not only the restaurant but my savings, my decisions, my agency. The days that followed became a theater of manipulation. Margaret began to tell anyone who would listen about my supposed forgetfulness, repeating stories that were either outright fabrications or gross distortions of minor slips. If I asked a customer's name twice, she would later recount it as evidence of memory loss. If I left the oven on for a moment while answering the phone, she would claim that I had nearly caused a fire. She spoke of these things with a tone of patient resignation, as though she were a dutiful daughter carrying the burden of an aging father. The cruelty was in the subtlety. To outsiders, she appeared concerned, compassionate even, while beneath the surface she was laying bricks in a wall meant to confine me. Then came the moment that tore away any lingering illusion. One Saturday afternoon, a bank representative came to the restaurant, asking to speak with me about recent account activity. Confused, I invited him into the office, where he showed me records of attempted withdrawals from my personal savings account, withdrawals I had not authorized. The amounts were large, far beyond anything I had ever needed in a single transaction. When I asked who had made the attempts, he hesitated, then said delicately, "Your daughter brought in certain documents, Mr. Meredith, asserting that she had authority to manage your accounts, but the bank flagged some irregularities and wanted to confirm directly with you." My hands shook as I looked at the records. Margaret had tried to move money under my name. When I confronted her later that evening, she did not deny it. She simply said, "Dad, you don't understand. You've worked all your life and you don't need all that money sitting there unused. Everett and I can make it grow. Invest it properly. It's for your own good." Her voice was calm, almost soothing, but the implication was chilling. My lifetime of labor, my careful savings, had become to her not a safeguard for my old age, but a resource to be absorbed into her plans. After that confrontation, I could no longer delude myself. I began to notice every glance she exchanged with Everett, every hushed conversation that stopped when I entered the room, every legal folder she carried with her. The betrayal was layered, but the core was unmistakable. My daughter was positioning herself to inherit me while I was still alive, to declare me incapable and fold my life into hers as though I were an obstacle to be managed rather than a father to be respected. One of the most painful moments came when she brought her children, my grandchildren, to the restaurant. I had not seen them in months, and I greeted them with open arms, eager to hear about their lives, their schools, their interests. Yet the warmth I expected was absent. They were polite, but distant, glancing at their mother as though seeking permission before answering me. Later, I overheard one of them whisper, "Mom says Grandpa forgets a lot now. We have to be patient with him." It struck me like a blow to the chest. Margaret had even poisoned their perception of me, planting the idea that I was slipping, that I was not fully present, that I was someone to be tolerated rather than cherished. In that moment, I realized she was not only stripping me of my autonomy, but of my legacy, reshaping the way future generations would remember me. The second escalation reached its peak when I discovered that she and Everett had scheduled a private meeting with another law firm, one specializing in elder guardianship cases. I learned of it not through her, but through a chance encounter. A former acquaintance from the community, now working as a clerk at the firm, stopped by the restaurant and mentioned it to me with hesitant sympathy. "Mr. Meredith, I probably shouldn't say anything, but I thought you should know. They've been discussing options to petition for guardianship over you. They're preparing documents." I thanked him quietly, my stomach churning, and later that night I sat in the apartment, staring at Eleanor's photograph again, my chest tight with both rage and sorrow. To imagine that my own daughter, the girl Eleanor had once cradled against her chest, could go so far as to strip me legally of the right to call myself competent. It was a wound I had never anticipated. It was in those sleepless nights that a different resolve began to form in me. For too long I had endured quietly, allowing humiliation after humiliation, convincing myself that patience was dignity. But now I understood that silence would not save me. Margaret was building her case methodically, and if I did nothing, the day would come when I would wake up to find my name erased from the restaurant entirely, my accounts emptied, my independence gone. I had to prepare not only for defense but for action, and though I did not yet know how, I felt the stirring of a will I thought grief had extinguished in me years ago. Eleanor's voice seemed to echo in my mind. "Be careful, Howard." Yes, I thought, careful but not passive. If my daughter had chosen to treat me as an obstacle rather than a father, then I would no longer accept the role of the silent old man shuffled to the corner. I would fight, not for money alone, not even for the restaurant, but for the last shred of dignity I could claim before death. The breaking point arrived not in a courtroom or through some official decree, but in the familiar setting of the restaurant itself, the very place where my life had unfolded for decades and where my daughter chose, perhaps without realizing the irony, to stage what she believed would be my final humiliation. She had invited me to a dinner that was presented as a family occasion, a gathering meant to celebrate new opportunities for the restaurant, though she remained vague about what those opportunities entailed. Her tone was falsely cheerful, and though every instinct in me told me to decline, I agreed to attend, because some part of me still longed for reconciliation, or at least clarity. I prepared carefully that evening, putting on the suit I had worn to Eleanor's funeral, not because it fit me well anymore, but because it was the only garment I owned that carried the weight of solemnity, the only one that reminded me of my own seriousness. When I entered the dining room, I saw immediately that this was no intimate family meal. Margaret and Everett were seated with a group of lawyers and potential investors, their folders and briefcases spread across the table like weapons. The air was thick with the smell of roasted meat and the low murmur of business chatter. But beneath it all, I sensed the cold machinery of strategy at work. Margaret rose to greet me, kissed my cheek in a way that felt both rehearsed and insincere, and guided me to a chair at the far end of the table, apart from the center of attention. She introduced me not as her father, but as the original founder, who now enjoys retirement while we handle the details. Her words carried the finality of a verdict, as though I had already been sentenced to obsolescence. I sat quietly, listening as they spoke about restructuring, about new branding, about financial streams that I scarcely recognized as belonging to the place Eleanor and I had built. At one point, an investor turned to me politely and asked what I thought of the new direction, and before I could answer, Margaret interjected, "He supports us, of course. He's proud to let the next generation take over." The table nodded in approval, and I felt the familiar heat of humiliation rise in my chest. Yet unlike before, this time I did not let it silence me. Something in me shifted, a final thread snapping, and I realized that if I did not speak now, if I did not assert myself with clarity and finality, I would vanish completely, reduced to the role they had scripted for me. I cleared my throat and spoke in a voice that surprised even me, steady and firm, carrying across the table without hesitation. That is not true. I am not retired, and I have not surrendered my rights. This restaurant is mine as much as anyone's, and I will not sit here while my daughter rewrites history. The room fell silent, the clinking of silverware ceasing, the lawyers shifting uncomfortably in their chairs. Margaret's face hardened, her carefully curated expression cracking for a moment to reveal shock, then anger. "Dad, please," she said through clenched teeth, her voice low but sharp. "Don't make a scene." I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the child I had raised, but a woman who saw me only as an obstacle to be managed. "No, Margaret," I replied. "The scene has already been made. You made it the moment you decided that I was nothing more than a figurehead. But tonight I will remind you, and everyone here, that I still exist." I reached into my jacket and placed a document on the table, one I had prepared after weeks of quiet consultation with an attorney of my own, a man who had known Eleanor and me for decades and who had guided me through the treacherous web Margaret had been weaving. The document announced the sale of my share of the restaurant, not to Margaret and Everett, as they no doubt expected, but to a third party, a respected local businessman who valued the restaurant's heritage and who had already signed the agreement. My portion, the controlling stake they had overlooked in their arrogance, had been transferred legally and irrevocably. The restaurant was no longer theirs to reshape at will. The shock on Margaret's face was almost unbearable to witness. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Everett lunged forward, snatching the papers, scanning them quickly, his expression darkening as he realized they were authentic, stamped and notarized. The investors shifted in their seats, whispering among themselves, the confident air of the meeting dissolving into uncertainty. Margaret finally found her voice trembling with fury. "How could you do this?" she hissed. "This is betrayal. This is our future. You've destroyed everything we've worked for." I looked at her steadily, my heart pounding but my voice calm. "No, Margaret. You destroyed it when you decided that I was no longer your father, but an inconvenience to be managed. You left me no choice." The room buzzed with tension, the lawyers flipping through their papers, Everett muttering about legal challenges, Margaret shaking her head in disbelief. I sat there in silence, letting the weight of my decision settle over them. For years I had been humiliated, diminished, erased. Tonight, for the first time in far too long, I had acted, not out of spite, but out of the desperate need to reclaim what little dignity remained to me. The restaurant, the building, the brand, those were things that could be bought and sold, but my identity as a man, as Eleanor's husband, as the one who had built this life, could not be taken from me unless I allowed it. And I no longer would. The dinner dissolved soon after, the investors making hasty excuses, the lawyers gathering their folders, leaving Margaret and Everett sitting in stunned silence. She glared at me as though I had ruined her life, and perhaps in her eyes I had. But as I walked out of the restaurant that night, the neon sign buzzing faintly above me, I felt something I had not felt in years. A sense of release, of justice, of having finally spoken the truth aloud. It was not triumph exactly, it was too late for triumph, but it was clarity, and in that clarity there was peace. In the days that followed the confrontation, I felt the kind of silence that arrives after a storm, heavy but strangely clarifying, as though the chaos had stripped away everything unnecessary and left only the bare truth standing. Margaret did not call me, and I did not expect her to. I imagined the conversations she and Everett must have had in their apartment. Voices raised in anger, accusations hurled not at themselves for their greed, but at me for refusing to play the role of the compliant old man who fades quietly into the background. Perhaps she believed I had betrayed her, though in truth all I had done was protect myself, protect Eleanor's memory, protect the small sliver of dignity that remained. For years I had been the one carrying the burden of patience, convincing myself that love could survive humiliation if I simply endured long enough. But love cannot survive when it is one-sided, when respect has been stripped away. That night in the restaurant had shown me with painful clarity that Margaret no longer saw me as a father, and if that was the case, then I could no longer cling to her as a daughter in the way I once had. The restaurant itself felt different once the transfer was finalized. The new majority owner, a man named Douglas, who had grown up in the neighborhood and remembered eating Eleanor's pies as a boy, came by to speak with me. He assured me that he valued the place for what it had always been, that he did not intend to strip away its identity or erase its history. He asked if I might stay involved in some capacity, perhaps as an advisor, or even just as a presence to greet the old customers who still came for the comfort of familiarity. I thanked him kindly but declined, because I knew my time there was over. I had fought the battle I needed to fight, and though I had not preserved ownership, I had preserved something greater. I had refused to be erased. Now I needed to step away before bitterness consumed me completely. Moving out of the apartment above the restaurant was harder than I expected. Every corner carried memories. Eleanor humming in the kitchen, Margaret's laughter as a little girl, the sound of the jukebox playing soft music in the evenings when the last customers lingered. I packed slowly, touching objects as though they were living things, whispering goodbyes that no one else would hear. Josephine helped me carry boxes to the small house I had rented on the edge of town, a modest place with a front porch and a patch of grass that caught the morning sun. She wept when she hugged me goodbye, promising to visit, and I told her she was as much family to me as anyone could be now. It was true. Loyalty, I had learned, is thicker than blood when blood chooses betrayal. In the quiet of the new house, I found a strange kind of peace. My days were no longer governed by the demands of the restaurant, and though I missed the rhythm, I did not miss the constant fear of being diminished in my own domain. I began to take morning walks, greeting neighbors who did not know my history and therefore saw me not as a relic, but simply as another man living out his years. Sometimes I would sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and think of Eleanor, imagining her beside me, her hand resting on mine. I spoke to her aloud sometimes, telling her what had happened, asking her forgiveness for not being able to hold Margaret closer, but also telling her that in the end I had remembered her words and acted before it was too late. I had not allowed myself to be written out of the story entirely. Margaret's absence in my life grew into a silence that I first experienced as grief, then gradually as relief. I realized that the pain I had carried for years had been the pain of chasing her approval, of waiting for a recognition that would never come. Now that hope was gone, the wound could finally begin to heal. I no longer checked the phone expecting her call, no longer lingered by the door hoping to see her face. Instead, I filled my time with small, ordinary pleasures, reading old novels, tending to the little garden behind the house, cooking simple meals that reminded me of Eleanor. The grandchildren did not visit, and though that absence hurt, I knew it was not their fault. They had been taught a certain story about me, and perhaps one day, when they were older, they might seek out the truth. Until then, I let go of the desire to control how I was remembered. I had learned the hard way that clinging to illusions only deepens the wound. Sometimes, when I walked into town, I passed by the restaurant. The neon sign still buzzed faintly, the windows still glowed in the evening light, and customers still moved in and out. I did not go inside, because it no longer belonged to me in the way it once had, but I felt no bitterness watching it from the sidewalk. It had been my life's work, and though the ownership had changed, the essence remained. That was enough. The betrayal had been real, the pain undeniable, but the final act had restored something inside me. The knowledge that I was not powerless, that I had not gone quietly into the shadow they tried to push me into. And so I live now in the calm of aftermath, no longer the owner of a restaurant, no longer the father in my daughter's eyes, but still a man who can look at himself in the mirror without shame. That is the legacy I choose to carry, not the false narrative Margaret tried to impose, not the erasure of my years, but the truth of having stood, however late, and said, I exist, I matter, I will not be forgotten while I am still alive. For an old man, that is enough, and perhaps it is even more than enough.